Yeah, I got asked to talk, and I'll probably have irritated everybody by the time that we're done here tonight. I've picked a whole bunch of pieces that, depending on where your oxes are, I think I've gored most of them in one way or another. Like a lot of folks, I straddle many different fences. And I'm going to talk about remote viewing, about science, about some paradoxes that emerge, about things that apply across science and also apply here. I would mention a couple of things of interest. I work part-time for an institution that's local here in Las Vegas called the National Institute for Discovery Science. If you follow the UFO community at all, that's what we do on a full-time basis, professional folks. And I am interested, I'm kind of throwing this out because I am interested in good information from people who've had firsthand high-quality experiences. So if you've got that, I'll be around for the next couple days and all that. As I mentioned, I'm going to have the next slide. I straddle the real world, and I will do an ad up front. This is what I do probably most of the time. I work in the area of non-lethal weapons. Anybody interested in the field or where I think the future of warfare is going to go, these are available out over at the Hampton Road bookstore. What's kind of interesting is this week is really kind of strange. Last weekend, I was down at the meeting that Russell Targ had just mentioned, the Society for Scientific Exploration. And that, again, is a scientific body that looks at a broad range of phenomenology. Throughout this week, I've been back at the National Academy of Sciences working in the weapons area, and the significance of that is going to come up a little bit later in the talk in a way that might be a little bit unusual. And then I end up here today talking about phenomenology. And I think there are some places where it crosses over. Next slide, please. For those who know, I usually throw up this slide when I'm teaching, but I do this for the conspiracy folks. Yeah, if you run my name on the internet, you come up with all kinds of strange things. So I just put out there and say that I will talk straight. There's no disinformation, and that will become important as you see, because I say when I start goring some oxes, you'll see why I make those statements. There are things I will not tell you, and if I don't, I'll just tell you I'm not going to tell you, and we'll leave it at that. Next slide, please. As we started developing this conference, we were looking at who was going to be here and asking some folks and some that chose to come and some others didn't. And I think there's a real paradox that arises with many of the UFO researchers. Just in phenomenology researchers. And what it is see, they really want to be scientists. And the reality is many of them are. I mean, you heard Elizabeth Rauscher, Russell Targ, Hal Puthoff. All of these folks come from hard scientific background. There's a paradox of people who go off into psi per se, because they want to be accepted as if they're real scientists. And when they do that, they find out that other scientists, if you will, real scientists, don't want to associate with them. However, it's mainly audiences like you who are out there who really would like to know, many of you who are not scientists, who would like to know there really is a basis for some of the things that you experience. And many of you are interested in knowing, and hearing from these folks. So I've been arguing with many of the scientists who want to go off and just pontificate in the scientific journals and the meetings talking to other scientists. The people you really ought to be talking to are the ones here in, who attend these kind of things, because they translate the information and actually apply it in daily lives. So I do applaud the people who are willing to stand up. A little later, I'm going to show you a bit of the price that can be paid for doing that. But I think that if the advances are ever going to be made, it's going to become because we interact with people who do this stuff, They don't know what it is, can't explain it. We do frequently get caught up in the chicken and egg problem that says, if you got a theory, unless you have a theory to explain things, it's like it's not real. And I'm not sure I understand that. Next slide. I'm going to talk to a few people here who have stood up and what happens when you do that. First one is a young English fellow by the name of Rupert Sheldrake. Some of you know his work and what he wrote in morphogenetic fields. He was kind of stunned one day. He wrote a really interesting book that came out, and he said he came home and found the mail, and a copy of Nature had just arrived. And we'll come back to Nature, because Nature is considered, in the natural sciences, one of the most prestigious scientific magazines in the world. And came home and he found a description there called a book fit for burning. And he says, wow, I wonder what that was. And he opened it and found out it was his book that they wanted to burn. The next case I find really probably the most interesting, and that's the guy by the name of Jacques Benveniste. Are most people familiar with homeopathy and homeopathic medicine and that? Did you know that back in the late 19th century, we actually, the difference between homeopathic medicine and allopathic medicine was split about 50-50 in the way it was taught in medical schools. And then what happened is, as chemistry came along and folks like DuPont started putting in large amounts of money into funding medical schools with a caveat that says you're going to teach allopathic medicine. And so what happened is you saw a great dropping off of people who were trained in homeopathy. If you're not familiar with it, it's instead of doing the chemical approach, or sort of the sledgehammer approach, what they do is it's very subtly taking very small amounts of a medicine and using that to treat illnesses. Now, when you get into homeopathy, there's a couple of schools. One of the things they do is they suggest that as you cut the dosage down more and more, it actually gets stronger, which is the reverse of the way we normally think about chemistry. Now, there's a split, because some will say that you can go to Avogadro's number. And what that means is I've divided this down to the point where there's one molecule of the substance left in the water, and that's as low as you can go, versus maybe you can go below that and actually split it and still get the same or possibly even stronger responses. Well, in about 1985, Benveniste in France did a number of studies, and he was coming up and showing, we won't go into the technicalities of it, but that water actually had a memory. So these things where you were implanting some kind of information on it, don't understand how that works, but it seemed to be happening, and it could be, in fact, physically verified. This became exciting. In about 1989, he wrote well, actually he wrote in about 87 or 88, he wrote a paper and submitted it to Nature. And Nature said, you got to be kidding me, this is not good enough. So they went out and they had other laboratories replicate it. And they actually had they had 4 additional laboratories independently come in, replicate the studies. 3 of the 4 got very significant results, similar to what Benveniste had. The 4th one was marginal. These laboratories were in different countries, so it was split pretty widely. And so finally, after going through the peer review process back and forth, and he jumped through all the hurdles, they published the article. screams arose, from the scientific community. So what did they do? They called on the great scientists to go in and straighten it out. You know who they called? Randy. That's right. Randy, and now there were a few others that went in there, but they take Randy, who, the amazing Randy, who I'm assuming, from the laughter, I assume everybody knows who he is, but a magician who is a debunker, basically. And they went in there and absolutely terrorized the laboratory. I mean, they just went in and wreaked havoc in there, terrorized the people, and came back, and what happened is Nature eventually published a retraction. So, well, of course we knew this wasn't true all along, but, we had to do it. Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting, this is an article dated 15 March 2001, in which they're now looking back, and this is the experiments have backed what was once scientific heresy. So what's happening is it took them, another 10 years to overcome that. But in the meantime, this guy was absolutely vilified. I don't know if you're familiar with the Ig Nobel Awards. They're kind of a counter award. It's not given out to people you like. But anyway, Benveniste is the only person to have actually run 2 Ig Nobel Awards, and has been skewered in many other places. And of course, just absolutely vilified. For those of you familiar with cold fusion, Pons and Fleischmann, similarly, now they probably got out in front of their headlights a bit, to be quite honest. And one of the problems that they had is they called it cold fusion, as opposed to something strange is going on here and we're getting some energy from places we don't understand where it was. So a lot of the emotional baggage that went with it was because was there fusion taking place or not? That immediately was jumped upon, and everybody came back to the results and said this can't possibly be true. And in fact, if you listen to many of the skeptic magazines on that, cold fusion is almost synonymous with nonsense. Having said that, if you go out there are journals on cold fusion, and there is work that's being done. Now, the problem probably was that it wasn't fusion, but there were energy releases that could not be accounted for. But rather than saying, gee, this is kind of interesting, how do we account for this? Can we look at this rationally in the laboratory? We excommunicated them, and they moved to Spain to continue doing research. Another guy, if you follow the abduction area at all, is John Mack. John's a Harvard, in the Harvard Medical School in psychiatry, a Pulitzer Prize winner, internationally known in several areas. And so he wrote a book called Abductions. It got out there, and what happened is his peers started getting on him, and he was eventually, even though he was not only a tenured professor, but had, long tenure established already, was called before boards and almost ended up losing his job over that. And this, again, was orchestrated from the outside. Hal and Russ, Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ, when the first reports came out on remote viewing, they too got hammered in various press. So I think the general approach is, if you got something you don't understand, kill it before it multiplies, instead of isn't it neat. Now, I like to use, can I have the next slide? See, what they do are ad hominem attacks, and I use this one because it was used against me. The interviews and the stories that were being reported on at this point, by the way, were about non-lethal weapons, pragmatic application of force in a really straightforward manner. And we had some back and forth. There was an article that was in Scientific American called Bang, You're Alive. And what was interesting is, about a third of the article had to do with me and didn't I do weird kinds of stuff and that sort of thing. And John Horgan, who wrote it, so I wrote a letter back, a rather lengthy letter going line by line saying, here's why I disagree with what you said. And I did put in there, by the way, I'm a member of the Society for Scientific Exploration, and I do advocate that we ought to be looking at these things in a serious scientific manner. To which he responded that said, since I'm interested in weird stuff, my judgment must be questioned. You know, just because other scientists don't agree with you, I equate that to it says the minority view will not be tolerated. The second one was the same type of article. This was in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And he was a little better, Steve Aftergood, but he came down very negatively in the whole area of minimizing collateral force and said that, as you see, that I should be in a science fiction novel, but not doing serious kinds of things. Interestingly, last fall, I got an email, and this stuff will be, the interaction will be published in some British journal coming up very shortly, in which he wrote back, and we had an email exchange. I saw something, and I sent him an email, and he says, is this the same John Alexander? And I said, yeah, of course. And he says, he said, you know, I think I blew it, basically, is what he said. What had happened, if you were watching the events in Palestine at the time, and the Intifada are rising again. He says, you know, I've watched this, and I think my highly theoretical arguments before kind of pale when you start looking at the real world. Next slide. I think one of the big problems that we have here is the difference between skeptics and debunkers. See, I would consider myself to be a skeptic. Having said that, I'm a skeptic who's seen a lot of really weird things happen, you know, firsthand. And so I've got this, I've got a category of things that I say, I know these things happen. PK, we'll talk about that some, and you heard Jack up here and have a chance to experience tonight, seen a lot of PK events happen. I've seen remote viewing happen, so I know this sort of thing. Then there's another whole category I have that calls If You Believe, which are a collection of interesting stories that are really hard to validate on that. But the difference is most skeptics are not, or people who call themselves skeptics are not skeptical, and if you look at psychops, for instance, they're debunkers. You know, they start from the premise, it can't be, therefore it isn't. Tend to disregard the facts, because I've argued with a number of them saying, here are the events that have happened under, you know, highly controlled situations, et cetera, and it just gets eliminated. It says, you know, we will not accept white crows even when they happen. And I think at this I gave an example of one of the things that did happen with a study before the National Research Council in which Ray Hyman, you know, we had the white crow flying right there in front of him. And if you talk to him today, it's like this just didn't exist, not there. The arguments that they get into, what they do is they pick on some small point and then extrapolate that. They say, well, if this tiny little piece over on the side is not real, then it can't be real. They also demand, usually, that things happen in the laboratory. Well, life doesn't happen in a laboratory. And there are a lot of things that don't happen in laboratories that are just as real. But the scientific paradigm wants to, you know, make this machine fit until we can chop it up into smaller and smaller pieces. The bottom line here is that when you get into debates, the problem that I think you have, I'm going to go to one in just a minute, is that you end up thinking that you're in a scientific debate, and what you're really doing is finding emotional arguments. And the problem here is you've trampled on belief systems as opposed to are you debating the science. Next slide, please. I put this up. You're not supposed to speak ill of the dead, and I'll be relatively kind, though there was a conference that I was at. It was an SSE meeting that I thought was one of the most incredible statements and things that I've ever heard. And what happened is that we were Well, first of all, I think everybody's familiar with the Cosmos series and the billions and billions and the statements and all of that, which is very interesting because at the end of it, he comes back, he builds this case that says there's billions and billions, there's got to be life out there, but there's not one shred of evidence. So it's kind of interesting because there's a book that I think is one of the best UFO books written. It's called UFOs, A Scientific Debate. It was edited by none other than Carl Sagan and Thornton Page. Now, what happens when I say edited, my guess is they didn't even read. I mean, I was convinced after listening to the line that there's not a shred of evidence. He didn't even read his own book. Because what you find is when you go into this book, that the proponents, if you will, were talking evidence. They were talking about photographs, electromagnetic anomalies, kind of facts. If you look at the opponents on the other side, and this is why it's a really nicely balanced book, and you read their things, it's all emotion. This is terrible, it's going to, et cetera, et cetera. So what the SSE does, it usually meets at a university or close to it and sponsored by it, and whenever you're there, you get some of their leading lights in. Well, this year we were meeting at Cornell, and because we were there, Sagan was invited, and he came in. And it was amazing to listen to this talk because he went on and says, well, we're all bright people here. The requirements at that time is loosened up some, but you had to be a PhD, working in your field, voted in, et cetera, to be a member. So it was pretty exclusionary at that time. The requirements for membership have loosened up quite a bit. But it was like, well, it's okay for us, who are with intellectual snobbery to sit around and discuss these things. But we can't allow this in the great unwashed public because they just don't understand it. They don't have the critical thinking capability necessary to do this. And if we allow them to do this, it's going to lead to the downfall of government. We just can't have this debate out there. We can't have them talking about it. And I think most highly synthesized, it came down to that free speech was going to be the downfall of democracy. Next slide. There are a lot of assumptions, and I think one of the problems is that you have a lot of things that are supposed to be myths. We assume myths aren't real. You have sightings. You always assume that sightings, anything that a person sees and reports back is suspect, no matter who it is. And there are some cases with, highly, highly qualified, respected people. And one of the ways to lose your, quote, respected people title is to report strange things. Even when you start getting physical evidence or capture hard evidence, and it doesn't happen until you've got, it becomes absolutely overwhelming that science is willing to shift. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to talk about how psi responds from the other side of the problem. This thing works both ways. And I'm going to suggest that we've got kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And one of the problems that we have with the scientific community when you're dealing with psi is they say, bring me a rock. And what I mean is that go out and get this, and then you come back, and they don't describe what this is, but just bring it back. And you bring them this, the evidence, and they say, well, not that evidence, I want some other evidence. And, no, not that evidence, get some other evidence. And this is a trap to a degree that parapsychologists have fallen into. Now, save that slide, and let me have it. Now, the good news is that what's happened because of that is when you get into studying parapsychology, they get really highly tight protocols. Now everybody knows about double-blind tests, and you just think, well, scientists are supposed to do double-blind tests. Well, they went in and did a review of scientific journals and articles in there and said, who does double-blind tests? Well, when they looked at the physical scientists, they found 0%. Now, of course, they don't believe that rocks have consciousness and all of that. Now, we're getting off into some belief systems here, but I mean, it's just a priori excluded. The need for a double blind is not there. But look down here at medical science. 6%. I mean, everybody assumes that all medical science is done in a double blind way. In other words, taking the experimenter effect out, and you don't do it. And then you find the difference, but even in psychology is down at 5%, and yet parapsychology is up there in the 85%. So I think that what that says is that the people who have worked in the fields of phenomenology have bent over backwards to take the experimenter effect out, to show that it's unbiased, whereas you don't find that in other types of science. The back one. Now, I'm going to talk about the bad, and here's where I'll probably start stepping on some serious toes, particularly if you have belief systems that believe in what's called MyLabs. Next slide, but save that one. I choose this one. There's a guy by the name of Helmut Lammer. And the hypothesis here is, for any of you that know about alien abductions, is that they're not really, these guys are saying it's not really alien, but the great they, and they say the military, is going out and conducting all of these abductions that are going on. There's several interesting aspects to this. Now, they would say that some are being done by the military, and there may be some ones where aliens slip in. That happens if they get to a point where they really can't explain anything. But the way this is done is that they have this magic little biochip. You've probably seen it, stuck up your nose someplace in your head or something like this. And that these people are then followed, tracked around. And that this has been available for, the technology has been available for decades. And the way you get away with this is it's the, quote, the black budget, which is infinite and you can do anything with it and all of that. And that the memories, the assumption is that the people who remember this have reliable memories and whatnot. And that the purposes run from mind control and behavior experiments to biological or genetic research, or they're trying to get information about real alien abductions that did take place. Next slide, please. Now, there are some arguments about that, particularly if you run in the scientific community. The notion of alien abductions has been around for several decades at least. If you extrapolate that back to some other kinds of phenomena, you find out that similar sorts of things have been going on for probably centuries, if not millennia, being reported. So therefore, the technology is definitely not available. I would submit that if we did have these kind of capabilities, there's a whole lot of national security issues. Keeping track of people are really important to us. At the time I drafted these up, you may remember we had 3 kids in Bosnia who had crossed the border and been picked up and were being held in Bosnia, and we wanted to get them back. Well, interestingly, we can't find people who are very, very important to us in order to get them back. Yet we can keep track of these people. None of the people who are self-proclaimed MyLab victims are really special. I mean, none of them are Nobel laureates, noted artists, highly skilled athletics. They don't have any particular characteristic, be it mental, psychological, creative, that you would want to keep, that there's any reason to keep track of. When you look at the manpower requirements, this was an article that I posted to them, and he started looking at, I don't know if you know how bad the things are in the military at the moment, but military is strapped. And one of the biggest problems is, well, for instance, when I left the Army, we had 18 divisions on active duty. We now have 10. Many of them are hollow, and not only that, you've got people who are coming and going on deployments and whatnot. So the manpower requirements in the Army are absolutely crucial right now. And it's for some reason, and you start doing this, and it ends up with thousands and thousands. It depends on how many MyLab do. The upper estimates are in millions. But the number of people who must be following these around get into huge numbers, just to do the thing. And then there's no whistleblowers come forward. In almost every other field, we've had whistleblowers come out and say, I did that, I was involved and whatnot. No real reason to do it. I can't think of a reason why we would want to follow these people for any reason to begin with. And the risk versus benefit. I mean, again, I don't know what you'd gain, even if you're doing a psychological study and all that. The risks of what that would do, I mean, we used to call this, people getting risky programs, you bet your budget. That if you got caught doing these kinds of things, the damage would not be to take away your money for that project. You would lose, entire credibility. So anyway, the MILABs are illogical, both technically and evidentially unsound. But the next slide, and there's a reasonable explanation. If you look at, what are the characteristics of paranoia, this fits really hand in glove. I really don't like that approach. Why am I concerned about that? Next slide, please. Helmut Lammer is not some nut. This guy's an astrophysicist who works in the Austrian equivalent of NASA. I mean, he's an established space scientist. He writes in credible journals, extremely well educated, and yet he comes to conclusions with a lack of veridical evidence. You see, I think an absence of critical thinking, that they have the ability to take abstract facts and pull them together in the most amazing fashion to make it fit. There's a lot of disenfranchised people out there. I think one of the things that is happening in the world today, and we certainly see it in the technologically developed world, is that, and there's some reason. There are some actions that have been taken by governments that don't make you feel real warm and fuzzy. And so these kind of things are happening out there. And so it increases the likelihood that these kinds of things will be accepted. I throw this up because when I teach graduate courses in studying various kind of phenomenology, I tell the students, you better understand conspiracy theory. Because if you get into this field, you're on one side or the other. I mean, it's just, you cannot be, if you're not part of us, you're part of them. Next slide. I was going to discuss quickly the ugly. Is anybody here, I assume some of you are familiar with the Disclosure Project that hit there? Okay, I'm going to put that in the ugly category. The reason is this. There were some pretty good witnesses there, people who had firsthand credibility and whatnot. They did not know until they arrived at the conference that the real topic was not talking about UFOs and whether their UFOs existed. It had to do with let's not weaponize space. There was a huge political agenda that was thrown on top of this. And I think they really missed a chance to talk, because what happened is they got a number of people in there with a political agenda which immediately shut down the people that they really were trying to influence Congress and the outside world. So that's a case in which you had some pretty good witnesses with some good information to say mixed in with some others and got the thing all gobbled up, and that tends to get deposited. It's just irreparable damage being done. Next slide. And the part of the issue was, I think there was a major learning that came out of this for the people in phenomenology who think, gee, this is important. If only I could get this information out there, we would convince the world and it would do this and that. There were some emails that followed this. One of the things that happened was that the whole hubbub came up about Timothy McVeigh and the documents that were found and then released by the FBI. And these people are actually wondering why the news media picked up on issues of capital punishment and the credibility of the FBI when they had thrown out this issue of, we ought to stop shooting down the aliens. When it got to the who cares, what you saw was, because I was watching this in the news media, knew it was coming. You found a few articles popped the first day. There were a couple of them that were straight. Most of them put in the giggle factor. There hadn't been an article since. So instead of having and creating a situation in which they gained the popularity they wish to account for, it just went absolutely nowhere. And I think if you're going to get involved in phenomenology, this who cares is a critical issue. And it does well if you find out, a real practical approach to, who really cares. General public, here there's a big difference I want to emphasize. If you ask the general public about belief in UFOs, for instance, over 50% of the people say we believe in them. Something like 7% say I've seen them. When you say, are you going to vote for your next congressman or senator based on that? No, it kind of drops off at that point. So if you're going to get involved in this, you've got to be able to answer these questions. Next slide, please. So what do you do when strange stuff happens? Most likely you don't do anything. You just don't tell anybody. The next thing is that they tend to tell close family and friends or report it to investigators. On the high end, it's kind of like you deny it happened. And I thought, like Jack Houck, who've taught a lot of PK parties, and people are at the party and wow, isn't this neat? And then they go away and you talk to them days later and what event? I wasn't even there. I don't even know what you're talking about. And that's the problem of being able to fit anomalous events into one's belief system. The other side of that is to incorporate into daily lives. People become, professional remote viewers, become, psychics, spiritual counselors, and whatnot. The next slide. This was done up by a friend of ours, Jacques Vallée, which is kind of important because what it suggests is there's a whole lot more data out there than is possibly ever collected. And what it says starts on the low end. The categories of strangeness run from very low, I saw a light flickering or something like that, all the way up to you're abducted but you don't know it. And you find some of that. So what happens is that, and this is kind of notional, but the important thing is the number of cases below the curve, those are the ones that are reported, are really relatively small compared to the cases up above the curve. Now, his category 2 and 3 would be something like, I saw a crash out there and something burning. Would people report that? Well, yeah, they'd report it, not because necessarily they thought it was a UFO, but it was very strange and it could do harm to them. It might start a fire or something of that nature. But as you taper off into really, really strange incidents, the farther out you get, the stranger the incident gets, the less likely it is to be reported. So what that means is, for those people studying phenomenology, there's a lot of really good cases out there that have never been found. And one of the areas that NIDS is involved in, for instance, are cases that have both high credibility and high strangeness, because we think that there's some real things to be learned there. Next slide. Yeah, now who believes? I wanted to mention a book, by the way, if you're going to study. This is it was self-published but available. It's a book called Best Evidence by Michael Schmicker. In fact, he was here at last year's conference. But what he's done is gone through and looked at all kinds of fields from ESP psychokinesis, PK, dowsing, near-death experiences, and describes a bit about it and then gives you some pretty good references. But the point on this is if you look at that, when you start looking at who believes in each of them, I won't go into the eaches, but you get down to the bottom, you find people who believe in at least one subset, 93%. So what we're saying is a belief in phenomenology is really quite high. Next slide, please. Oh, I might mention, I won't change that one, but the Gallup poll 1 week ago came out, and his figures came out from studies that were done about a decade ago. The Gallup poll came out 1 week ago with another study looking at belief in various kinds of phenomenology. What they found is over the past decade, in the general public, this belief has actually increased. Now, what's the problem? Here's one of the problems. What you see is this is a slide that says if I ask the general public who's interested in phenomenology, it's really pretty high. That particular figure is a little lower than 93, but it's well up there. If you talk to professors in general, it's a little bit lower than that. The AAAS was the American Aeronautics and Astronautical Society. And these are people who spend a lot of time looking at the sky and things like that. And they tend to be pretty high. Then I mentioned that we'd come back to the National Academy of Sciences. It was those folks I work with. You get down here and it's in the, you gotta be kidding me. I can tell you, I do have some interesting interactions because I do broach it, and a fair number of them say, I don't believe that, but let me tell you what happened. This is what I saw once, sort of thing. So, and again, I think it's a difference from personal acceptance versus, professional acceptance. One of the, I might mention, I'll rat on Ray Hyman. When he was doing the study for the National Research Council, came to me and we were discussing PK specifically, and PK metal bending sorts of things, and he was looking at it and he says, well, I don't have to address this because there aren't that many studies that are out there, and we're only required to look at published studies. He said, well, what do you think about it? He says, well, there's just too many high-quality people who have reported personal experiences. So that's, one-on-one, and he'd probably deny it, because certainly when the writing came out, there was nothing in there that indicated any, even propensity to believe that. Next slide, please. There's a word that I have just introduced into the English lexicon. I can say it's formally introduced now because I have an article that is published in the current Harvard International Review. It just came out in the past couple of weeks. I was surprised when I got it by the editors, but it really addresses many of the problems that we have in discussing phenomenology as well as in life in general. And I've identified this as the misidentification of causal relationships. One that I get into a lot, again, this gets back to the non-lethal work, and I'm going to take this to remote viewing in just a minute. But surprisingly, the people who attack me most vociferously are the International Red Cross and the ACLU. And we have some really interesting debates in there. And basically they say, well, these are instruments of torture. And my position is that technology doesn't cause bad behavior. Any technology can be used. And that you also find in the press, and I'm going to really ding them in a couple of minutes, but anytime we talk about a gas of any kind, like pepper spray or that sort of thing, it suddenly gets equated to Nazi death camps. Next slide. Oh, there was an article in The Futurist that came out a little over a year ago. What they didn't tell me was that there was somebody writing kind of a counter-argument alongside. So one of the things they did was they published a picture. And this is a Tibetan monk who had been incarcerated by the Chinese for some period of time, and he was saying it was kind of the ain't it awful, look at they use stun guns and product on me and all that. So what I did is had my lovely assistant, she'll flip down a slide. What we did is, no, flip that down, yeah, slide over. We decided to look at all the instruments of torture. Now, I have said publicly that I am against the public export of the most common torture instrument of the world. However, our tobacco lobby is far too strong to prevent that from happening. But the point is that, by the way, hammers are a good example. It's been used particularly in North Korea, and as I say, nobody's made it past the third knuckle. Next slide, please. So I think part of the ergofusion that happens when we debate remote viewing, for instance, is if you don't get the target, they say, if an individual didn't get a specific target, therefore remote viewing doesn't work. No, it means the individual didn't get the target. There's no good theory, and there's a lot of debate. And you heard Elizabeth start to talk about some of these things like Minkowski space and whether you have certain non-local interconnections. I assume Ed Mitchell tomorrow night will talk about the holographic universe. So there's a host of things out there, but we don't have a good model and a theory that proves causal relationship between remote viewing. And on the other hand, that doesn't mean it can't work, but there are those who profess that if you can't explain it, it doesn't work. I haven't seen it, it doesn't exist. I'll admit there's a lot of things that you haven't seen that really do exist. I saw Randy. Randy is one of my favorite guys, by the way. By the way, there was a thing on Larry King about a week ago. What's her name? Rosemary Altella did a debate and held her own. I was surprised because Randy has this $1 million offer that's out there. And I got to tell you, if you think there's any way that you can possibly win that $1 million, you should come and see me. I'll make you the same offer, But anyway, he says, if I saw Randy fake it, therefore, everybody's faking it. We used to do that in PK. I will tell you in the PK arena, when you hear that there's never been a magicians involved, that's absolute nonsense. Doug Henning was over at my house. Some of you remember Doug died about a year ago, but he was in and had some really spectacular bending happen. Interesting, the first guy that had this big bending was his manager, so he knew that it wasn't somebody that we planted in there. I like the one there. When I'm dealing with the media, who I frequently encounter, and I ask them all the time when they get into these areas that I say, well, you're always taught that there's two sides to every story, and they go, yeah, right. So give me the positive side to genocide then. No, I'm sorry, there are stories where there aren't two sides. There are things that are really true, and that's it. Next slide, please. This is, I'll just cover this briefly since I'm wrapping everybody. I think one of our biggest problems is in the bottom arena there. What I say is there's a huge connection between the change in national security issues. I think one of the biggest ones has to do with education. And I think one of the biggest problems that we have in education is that we spend too much time teaching people what to think and too little time teaching them how to think. Next slide. For those who engage the media, one of the biggest problems I got to stop saying biggest problems. There's so many huge problems out there. There seems to be in journalism school the notion that if I can teach you to write well, you can write about, you instantly become subject matter experts on everything. And therefore you can just write on any topic. They're always on deadline, the expose, but one I do want to hit here is Lexis and Nexis. No bad deed ever dies. And if you're familiar with these, this is where they go. This is their graveyard. Everything that's ever written, if you go on the internet now and do a Google search or whatever it is, even when things have been thoroughly disproved time after time after time with hard evidence, it ends up in Lexis and Nexis. And what these people do, again, uneducated, they put in keyword searches, it pops out, and they pull out. The other thing we do is we end up, get a skeptic. You got to find a skeptic in there. Even though you find the people who are giving the story are highly qualified, far more highly qualified, done careful research in the field, but you got to get a skeptic whether or not they apply. Now, I'm getting a high sign in the back. Skip.
Yeah, blame it on me. Go ahead.
Skip the next slide. And there is one that there is some things I want to just briefly hit on improbabilities. Does everybody agree that if your heart stops, you're dead and your brain and no brain activity and all of that? Let me have the next slide. There is a case that I think if there were a case that proves the issue, this is it. This one, by the way, it's listed briefly in that, and Michael Sabom has it in Light and Death. But you've heard about, yeah, turn it, da-da-da-da-da. You've heard about near-death experiences. This is a case, a woman, August of 1991, she used the pseudonym of Pam Reynolds. At 35, a giant basal artery aneurysm, meaning a weakness in the stem of the brain. And very, very dangerous, and they decided to do, you don't want to do this for cosmetic surgery or anything, because they did what's called hypothermic cardiac arrest. In other words, we stopped you, okay? They lowered the body temperature to 60 degrees. This went on for about an hour and a half. The heart stopped, breathing stopped, the blood was literally drained out of the brain. They had a test going, they had EEGs monitoring all along. Initially, they had a 100 dB sound being put into the ear. It was a click that was going off so they could measure any sensory response whatsoever. She died. I mean, by every known clinical standard, this woman was dead for some period of time. What did she report? Well, one of the things she reported, first of all, is what's known as the autoscopic position. She's out of body, up above, looking at the surgery and all that. Now, what was interesting here is she was anesthetized in another room and then brought into the OR, so she did not see the room and the setup ahead of time. She described to Sabom, said, well, there was this buzzing sound. It sounded kind of weird, and it looked like an electric toothbrush. And he goes, well, this is crazy, you know, what do you mean, electric toothbrush? And that didn't make sense at all. But described the position of all of these, then eventually left, and she went out and met deceased relatives and things of that nature. So in coming back, she described all of this. By the way, this was the correct layout as it was described. The electric toothbrush turned out to be kind of interesting because he went and talked to the surgeon. And it turns out that they have a little small handheld device with a blade on it, using for opening a cranium that does look a lot like an electric toothbrush, and it does have a very unique, distinctive sound. My point in presenting this case, when you get into phenomenology, there are a few cases that are out there that absolutely defy description, and what they suggest is this wasn't a near-death experience, this was a death experience, although some will argue that that was permanent. Yeah. Flip to the second to the last slide, because I'd like to ding on remote viewers too. It is guaranteed to irritate. No, then second to the last, yeah. Some of the problems that we have, I think, in the remote viewing community is, and many of you are familiar, I'm not going to name names or anything, there's enough of them out there, but we're having outrageous claims. And one of the things that IRVA is interested in is establishing standards, because we think that that's necessary. The lack of verifiability, the lack of established thing, and what I call a martial arts syndrome. And I don't think this is useful. And in the martial arts, you know, you train under your master, and you kind of go along with that school. And I see some of those problems here. I think the remote viewing being really in its infancy as a discipline, it would do a lot better to come together and stop all the bickering and infighting. So for those who are looking for the absolute scientific answer, I don't think it's there. Let me have the last slide. I think from a practical standpoint, you ought to use the Nike approach. Okay. So,
Thank you very much, John. Got time for a couple of questions here. I'll race on over there with the microphone, doing my little TV talk show host thing. I love this. By the way, I had a question myself. You had that nice chart up there with that little sloping diagrams, that scientific kind of thing you do for. Well, it had that number of unreported cases. How can you measure unreported cases? Isn't that by mere fact that it's not reported means it's not able to be counted?
Well, yeah.
That's just me talking. I'm a non-scientific kind of guy.
You can project probabilities because there are, and many of them you can make And again, it was a notional chart.
Damn, I thought I was going to catch you
But
with
we
a deer in
do
the
know,
headlights here, you know?
what we do know is, from experience, as you go in and talk to people, that the stranger the event is, the lower the probability is that it will be reported, particularly to outsiders.
Yeah, I don't tell anybody I know you people. Okay. We have a short question here, too.
First of all, let me just say I have great respect for your boss, Robert Bigelow, who funds NIDS and the research that he does. Very much appreciate what he does in the UFO area, and I'm very disappointed to hear that he's withdrawing funding, or NIDS is withdrawing funding in the consciousness research area to sort of focus on the UFO, because I think in the past he's funded such people as Dean Radin's work at Nevada, great stuff, so I'm a little disappointed. The other good thing, though, I'm glad that you're going to be given bi-monthly reports on Art Bell on the work that is going on.
Right.
So a lot of good, a little bit of
Yeah,
bad.
I would tell you that at our last advisory board meeting, there are some discussions of opening this up broader, in broader fields again. I would remind you, however, that he does have a chair. He did fund the chair of consciousness at UNLV, and Raymond Moody is here. So there's a substantial effort, from him in that area. I mean, it's $3.7 million to establish the chair, so not insignificant.
Okay. That pretty much takes care of it. Thank you very much, John. Very appreciate